Hi there. For the first video, I wanted to spend some time thinking about the Middle East. What do you think about when you think about the Middle East? You probably think about a geographic area. You might also think about a language, Arabic, and a religion, Islam. You might also think about specific political issues, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, oil wealth, or jihadi terrorism. Before embarking on any project, it's important to get an idea of its scope. How big is it? So, what is the Middle East? The Middle East is an ethnocentric term. What that means roughly is that the term defines itself relative to a particular ethnicity. The term, I think more specifically, is Eurocentric. It's Eurocentric because the Middle East designates areas that are east of Europe, but not as far as the Far East. In fact, the term the Near East was in common use until World War I. The Middle East only really came to have its current meaning during World War II, where the Middle East was a minor theater of the war. Of course, from the perspective of the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East is really the Middle West. And why not call it West Asia? After all, most of the Middle East is in Asia, and it's the western part of Asia until you run into Africa and Europe, right? The problem is not so much the Middle East is a flawed term. The problem is that the alternatives that we've come up with so far are worse. West Asia seems to exclude Egypt as well as all of the Maghreb and northern Africa, and the Arab world seems to exclude Turkey, Israel, and Iran, which are not Arab countries. Even inhabitants of the region seem to have adopted the term, so that's a pretty good clue that the term has become acceptable, despite the fact that ultimately it refers to an area east of Europe. The most popular newspaper in the Middle East comes out of Saudi Arabia and is called The Middle East. I want to submit to you a perhaps controversial proposition. The term Middle East is used in English because it frames a set of political relationships, or at least in the minds of English-speaking people, it frames a set of political relationships. It's not primarily a geographic location. The Middle East is, in other words, as big or as small as the political conflicts that define it. The term, in other words, is geopolitical. Let's take a look at what the term definitely includes, the areas of the world that are definitely part of the Middle East, and then we'll look at some cases where we're not so sure. The Levant. The Levant is this area comprising Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. It's basically the area between Egypt and Turkey, and it's an area that has Iraq and Saudi Arabia to the east of it. Jerusalem is one of the holiest cities in Islam. The Levant has always been part of the Caliphate, no matter where the Caliphate was located. Damascus in Syria was the capital of several early Arab empires. Most inhabitants in this region are Muslim, ethnically Arab, and Arabic-speaking, even when they're not Muslim or Arabs. So it's clearly part of the Middle East. Also clearly part of the Middle East is Egypt. Egypt is partly ethnically Arab, it's definitely Arab speaking, and it's 90% Muslim. And from the 1940s to the 1990s, Cairo was the center of Arab nationalism, as well as the center of the resistance to Israel and support for Palestine. Even though most of Egypt is in Africa, when the English coined the term the Middle East, their main colonial interest in the region was Egypt, and especially the Suez Canal, which links the Mediterranean with the crown jewel of the English Empire, India. Egypt, therefore, is clearly part of the Middle East. What about Anatolia? Well, Anatolia is what today we would call Turkey. A very small part of Turkey is in Europe, on the other side of the isthmus, but most of Turkey is in Asia, and historically, Turkey has definitely been part of the Middle East. I mean, Istanbul was the seat of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled all of the Middle East and North Africa for hundreds of years. Turks, though, are not Arabs. And linguistically, they don't speak Arabic, nor do they write their language in the Arabic script, but they are mostly Muslim. Now, some have argued that Turkey is less part of the region than it once was. Turkey, after all, is somewhat different from the rest of the Middle East. It's democratic, it's a member of NATO, it was part of the European state system even in the 19th century. Today it has been applied to be a member of the European Union for many years now, and it's more developed industrially than many parts of the region. On the other hand, just this year, Turkey bombed ISIS forces in Syria and continues to repress and monitor its large Kurdish minority in the east, a Kurdish minority that shares many ties with Syria and northern Iraq. Moreover, Turkey borders many Middle Eastern countries, including Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So, again, Turkey, historically, geographically, culturally, very much part of the Middle East. Also part of the Middle East most clearly is the Arabian Peninsula, which includes Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. The Arabian Peninsula contains Mecca and Medina, the most holy sites in Islam, and is the cradle of Arabic civilization. It was from the deserts of Arabia that the armies of Muhammad swept all over what is today the Middle East and North Africa, and even into Europe. So it doesn't really get more Middle Eastern-y than the Arabian Peninsula. However, it's worth noting that the population of the Arabian Peninsula is quite small. Its politics are fairly repressed, and its oil ties to countries outside the region are also strong. Maybe not as strong as the ties that bind it to the region, but nonetheless, geopolitically, it's not the center of the Middle East. Indeed, it has not been the political center of the Middle East for a long time, although that might be changing. Also part of the Middle East is this area called Mesopotamia, roughly between the Levant and Persia, to the north of the Arabian Peninsula and to the south of Anatolia. You have this area that roughly comprises the modern countries of Iraq as well as the northeastern parts of Syria. Iraq and Kuwait are clearly part of the Middle East. They're Arabic speaking, they're ethnically Arab, they're one of the first areas that were conquered by the armies of Muhammad. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, was the seat of several caliphates, and Iraq has been one of the most important influential countries in the region since its independence, so there's no doubt that Iraq is at the center of what we call the Middle East. Persia. Persia is a little bit of an interesting case because Persia has definitely been linked to the Middle East from a very early time, but Persians, who are modern-day Iranians for the most part, as well as some Azeris, Persians don't speak Arabic, they're not ethnically Arab, and they don't share quite the same sect of Islam. Iranians are Shia Muslims, not Sunni Muslims. But Persia, nonetheless, has been part of the politics of the Middle East for a long time. Several caliphates were Shia caliphates based out of Persia, and both historically during the colonial period and in the more modern period, Iran has very much been in the thick of Middle Eastern relations. Okay, what about the Maghreb? Now we're talking about regions that are less clearly part of the Middle East. The Maghreb is the Arabic-speaking and ethnically Arab region of North Africa. On the plus side, when riots erupt in Gaza, which is Palestinian territory near Israel, when riots erupt in Gaza, they tend to also cause riots in Algiers, in Algeria. Proof that the regions are politically related. People in the Maghreb share a language and a religion, usually, with other inhabitants of the Middle East, and they see themselves, most importantly, as tied and related to the Middle East. On the other side, geographically, the Maghreb is not east of Europe. It's south, and some of it is even west of Europe. Moreover, the recent colonial history is different. It's mainly French, not English or Ottoman. And most importantly, the Maghreb is very clearly on the continent of Africa, and so it's very hard to call it the Middle East. Still, most scholars today consider the Maghreb as being part of the Middle East, or if they want to get technical about it, they call it the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. Okay, what about Afghanistan? Now, originally during World War II, Afghanistan was considered part of the Middle Eastern theater of the war. It was a link between the oil fields of Persia and Iraq, controlled by the British, and their Russian allies, who often needed to be supplied. Afghans are often Muslim, but like the Turks, they're not Arabs or Arabic speaking. They mainly share ethnic ties with Persia. But if we're including Iran, then maybe we can make a case for Afghanistan. On the downside, Afghanistan doesn't just have links to other countries of the Middle East, it also has very strong political, cultural, and linguistic ties to what we would call Central Asia. That is to say, countries which end countries ending in stan, right? Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan. And so few, for that reason, would want to include them in the Middle East, but instead would want to include them in Central Asia, a different sort of geopolitical environment. Moreover, Afghanistan is strongly shaped by Russian imperialism and Soviet rule. Furthermore, when Palestinians riot, Afghans in Kabul don't, suggesting that perhaps the people of Afghanistan don't see themselves as quite as related to those in the Middle East. However, more recently, the United States' war on terror has brought the problems of the Middle East to Afghanistan. Also, fighters from the Middle East have congregated in Afghanistan to fight the United States. And so, politically speaking, the war on terror seems to have brought Afghanistan back into the Middle East in some respect. Another arguable case is this region, which is the Horn of Africa, across the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula. Now, some of these countries are clearly not part of the Middle East. So, for example, Uganda and Kenya and Ethiopia are not Muslim. They're not Arabic speaking primarily, and their politics aren't related to oil or the Arab-Israeli conflict or Islam. Yes, I know there have been some bombings in Kenya on the part of Muslim extremists, but there have been bombings in Paris and New York too. So that by itself is not going to bring Kenya into the Middle East. On the other hand, more interestingly, Sudan, Djibouti, and Somalia are dominant Muslim countries where Arabic is very widely spoken, although none are ethnically Arab. None of these countries are in Asia, which is kind of a mark against them, and none are really historically part of it in the Middle East. They weren't really parts of any historical caliphates, for example. However, the recent politics of Sudan and Somalia and the presence of jihadi terrorism in both countries have given us reasons to link these areas to the Middle East, even though I think many would argue that these links are pretty tenuous. Okay, so we've considered some cases that are pretty clearly part of the Middle East, and we've considered some cases that are more marginal. What do scholars say? Well, let's see. Textbook by Monty Palmer, Politics of the Middle East. You can see the slightly darker area shaded here is what they consider part of the Middle East. What they haven't included is the Maghreb, and they haven't included Somalia, but they have included Sudan, but not Afghanistan. All right. Louise Fawcett, in her International Relations of the Middle East, takes a much more expansive view of the Middle East, going as far west as Mauritania, including Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Iran, but still not Afghanistan. Okay. Sorenson, an introduction to the Middle East, doesn't go as far as Mauritania, but pretty much covers all the other countries, including Sudan and South Sudan, as well as North Africa. Ismail and Ismail go as far west as Mauritania, but also include Somalia and Afghanistan as part of the Middle East. Gazierovsky has a more restrained view, does not include the Sudan, does not include Somalia, does not include Afghanistan. Andresen, Siebert, and Wagner are of the more restricted variety. It's not 100% clear all the countries they consider in the Middle East, but it looks like Afghanistan and maybe even Pakistan are part of the Middle East. And certainly if we're thinking about the war on terror, we are also thinking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it doesn't look like Somalia is included, although again, this map isn't particularly clear. So, if the Middle East is not a geographic area, but instead a set of interrelated cultural, linguistic, and political relationships, then I think we have to face some uncomfortable questions. The first question is the United States part of the Middle East now? After all, we've been involved politically and culturally in the region for a very long time. Second, does the scope of this course expand and contract based on the time period concerned? Right? So if we're talking about the 1800s, are we talking about a different set of countries than if we're talking about the 1990s or the 2000s? These are tough questions. I think the best way to approach this is to think of the Middle East as a cluster concept. That means there aren't really any necessary and sufficient criteria to determine whether a country is part of the Middle East. But if enough criteria among a series of criteria are met, a country starts to become part of the region. So you might think of the types of criteria that we think about. Is the country a Muslim majority? Is it Arab speaking? Is it ethnically Arabic? Do they have extensive conflict or cooperation with other established members of the region? Do they have geographic borders with other established members of the region? And are they or are they not part of historical caliphates? And I'm sure you could think of more than these, but these are the ones that I came up with. And then it's also possible that some of these criteria may be more heavily weighted than others, more important than others. So the question is, does this work? Here are our criteria on the left. I'm going to present a set of cases on the right. What about Israel? Well, Israel doesn't meet criteria number 1, it doesn't meet criteria number 2, it doesn't meet criteria number 3 for the most part, but it does meet 4, it does meet 5, and it does meet 6, right? So it's got about half of the characteristics, and yet most people would say Israel is very central to the region, in part because of number 4 here, conflict and cooperation with other members of the region. The Arab-Israeli conflict defines the politics of the Middle East for much of the second half of the 20th century. Let's consider another case, Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan is a Muslim majority, but not Arabic speaking, not ethnically Arab. Has some amount of conflict and cooperation with other regions, but not a lot of conflict if you think about it, but some cooperation. It does share geographic borders with Iran, but not really part of historical caliphate. So it's got 2, 2.5, and that's one of the reasons why very few, well, only a couple of the scholars that you just saw maps from included Afghanistan as part of the Middle East. What about the Sudan? Another case that was sometimes included, not included. It's Muslim majority. Yes, it's Arab speaking or Arabic speaking, but not of Arabic ethnicity. They do have a fair amount of cooperation with other established members of the region. They share a geographic border with Egypt, but not really. I mean, maybe small parts were part of the historical caliphate. So we've got 3, 3.5, 3.25. Maybe there's a reason why lots of people include Sudan. And we could go on down the list with all the countries. But what I'm trying to do is get you to think about what counts as the Middle East and what doesn't. So I think that's about it. But the bottom line here is that we're talking about a diverse region of which some countries are more central to than others. We are talking about a region that perhaps changes over time. And that kind of sets the scope of our investigation.